Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shannon Bauer. I'm a coordinator for TBTI's Inland Fisheries Cluster, and I'll be one of your hosts and speakers for today's event. I wanted to start us off by saying thank you. So thank you to our hosts, our speakers, and our panelists for agreeing to be with us today, and to all of you for joining us to share your precious time to talk about the future of inland fisheries. So you'll be hearing from me a little bit later on. But for now, I would like to turn to the first session today by introducing our first host, Acacia Frimpong-Manso. So Acacia is a master's candidate researching the biological and sociological perspectives in shoreline habitat management of freshwater ecosystems. She'll be telling us all about how today's session will run and then introducing our first speaker. So Acacia, the floor is all yours.
Perfect. Thank you for the kind introduction, Shannon. Oops, sorry about that. I just wanted to, let me just put this, sorry about that, 1 second. Perfect. So thank you, Shannon, for the kind introduction. And I just also wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to attend this seminar. So quickly, as Shannon said, I'll be explaining how today's session is going to be working. So first, we have a presentation by Dr. Stephen Cook on the current state of global inland fisheries. And following Dr. Stephen Cook, if we have enough time, we will do a short Q&A. Following that, we will then move into a short series of presentations followed up by a panel discussion on actions and solutions. And then following this, we will lead through a brief presentation on the potential role of art, music, and story in invoking positive emotions and actions for fisheries. And finally, we will wrap things up with a group discussion for the current and both prospective members to discuss the cluster's future. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Stephen Cook. Dr. Stephen Cook is a Canada Researcher Professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. His work spans the natural and social sciences with a focus on solving environmental problems that involve fish and fisheries. He's particularly passionate about freshwater ecosystems. Dr. Cook is a past president of the international section of the American Fisheries Society and is a board member of the Freshwater Working Group of the Society for Conservation and Biology. And he's also the secretary of the college and the Royal Canadian Society of Canada. So without that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Stephen Cook.
Hi, folks. Just want to make sure everybody can see the screen all right. Should be up there. Excellent.
We can all see your screen.
Perfect. All right. It's my pleasure to join you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples just south of Ottawa, Canada. Today, I have the pleasure of talking about the intersection between freshwater fish biodiversity and inland fisheries. So only in the last decade or so have we really started to understand the magnitude of the inland capture fisheries. And in this case, I'm excluding the recreational sector. It's certainly growing steadily with almost 95% of those catches coming from developing countries. There's certainly been greater reporting in the last decade or so, so that could possibly be, possibly and indeed certainly is contributing to that the apparent increase in value, if you will, of that fishery. But we still believe that this is a gross underestimate of the actual yield. It may be several times greater. Right now, the estimate is that about 9% of the entire global fish catch comes from inland sources, but that really doesn't reflect the true importance of inland fisheries. To give you an example here, I'm going to lean on this synthesis paper produced by Abigail Lynch that does a really great job of outlining the various ways, the diverse ecosystem services that freshwater fish and fisheries provide around the globe. And I'm just going to hit on a few of those that I think are particularly important. So first of all, we security. And this tends to be in areas that are the most food insecure. So we can think about some areas in Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. And indeed, that's what's highlighted here. These are areas where we see the highest level of freshwater fish consumption. And in many ways, this freshwater fish provides a safety net that people can rely on when other foods are unavailable. Livelihood go along with this, so the income that community members can generate, so that they can buy other goods, and then of course, coming from Canada, we have prominent Indigenous communities, and we're certainly well connected with the concept that freshwater fish link to culture and spirituality. Yet at the same time, we know that freshwater fish and freshwater biodiversity more broadly isn't doing so well. And so this is the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet Index. And you can see since 1970, which is when everything's indexed as if it were pristine, and we know that's not the case, but we can see that our freshwater fish biodiversity, freshwater biodiversity is down some 83% in 2016 relative to those 1970s levels. That's substantially lower than the numbers we see for marine and terrestrial. Their populations in general are doing much better. Freshwater biodiversity is doing rather poorly. This has been highlighted recently in a really impressive document led by Kathy Hughes and the World Wildlife Fund called The World's Forgotten Fishes. And it's all about the state of inland fish and fish populations and fisheries around the globe. If you haven't checked it out, I certainly encourage you to do so. We're dealing with tons of threats, and David Dudgeon in 2006 wrote a seminal paper describing all of the threats that were facing freshwater biodiversity. Along with a team of co-authors, we recently revisited this list and realized that, wow, we can't done a great job of addressing those problems. And guess what? There's a bunch more that are on the horizon. So in Andrea Reed's paper, I just blowing up that threat diagram here, you can see all of the things we're dealing with: invasions, infectious disease, harmful algal blooms, and so on. And these are all of the threats and stressors that freshwater fish populations have to deal with. And in many cases, if you look at the top there under L, are cumulative stressors. These things are not acting alone. They're acting in concert to create even bigger problems, more complicated problems for us to solve. And of course, demand is not going away. So by 2050, the need for fresh water for consumption will increase by 55%. Food consumption will increase by 60%. And along with that, we know that fresh water is a very important contributor to agriculture. And the expectation that electrical demand will be up 80%. And we will lean heavily on things like hydroelectricity to help meet that rising energy demand. One of the things we realized is that we are at a crisis time for freshwater biodiversity, and we need to bend the curve. So the curve is going in the wrong direction. Things are going downhill. And if we continue with business as usual, by 2030, 2040, 2050, we're not going to have much left in terms of freshwater biodiversity. So the emergency action plan that the WWF has created has 6 key activities, actions that you can see off to the right there: accelerating implementation of environmental flows, improving water quality, and so on. These are certainly things we need to do. We also need to think about what we can do specifically for inland fisheries. And so I want to point to the UN FAO Rome Declaration from 2015, which really lay down a series of 10 steps that we need to do to ensure that we have healthy, sustainable, and responsible inland fisheries around the globe. At the end of the day, This is going to take all of us working together, and it's not just us, those folks that care about fish. We're going to need the politicians. We're going to need the broader public, stakeholders, rights holders to all work together. And I'm just going to read a quote from one of our papers. We foresee a future where there's the political will and public desire to properly assess and manage inland fisheries in an integrated water resources management framework to benefit society while balancing needs for conservation of biodiversity. I've underlined the word balancing because that's what it's all about. It's not about fish or people or biodiversity. It's about fish, people, and biodiversity. And so we need to find win-win-win solutions so that we support the individuals that depend on fish for their livelihoods, for food. We need to have healthy aquatic ecosystems for the sake of biodiversity and its intrinsic value, but also the immense value that biodiversity and healthy aquatic ecosystems bring to our fellow global citizens. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to furthering that conversation today and focusing on solutions. I've hit on some of the problems. We need to figure out the solutions, and we need to make that happen together. Thanks so much.
So perfect. So now we are going to open up the floor to questions because we do have a bit of time. So if anybody has a question, you can feel free to take yourself off mute, or you can put it in the chat function and I can read it to Steve. So I'll just give a minute or two for people to get their questions in. If not, I have some questions for you myself, Steve. Okay, so I guess I'll go first while people gather their thoughts. I guess, what are some actions that potential ecologists, environmentalists can do in terms of getting the attention of policymakers in hopes of their research being transformed into actual policy change?
Yeah. I think part of it is demonstrating the value of fish, and I think as a community we've failed to do that. If you ask the average person walking down the street, hey, tell me about a fisheries issue, even if they live on a freshwater body, they're probably going to start telling you about the state of the world's oceans. And that's fantastic that, the oceans certainly need our help and attention. But I think we forget what's around us. And that's why I love the, using the word forgotten to describe freshwater fisheries. It's true. We forget about them, even when they're literally at our feet. So I think that's part of it. And then I think the other thing we need to do is also find an optimistic tone. We've heard about ocean optimism. We also need inland fisheries optimism. We need to find success stories, figure out what's worked, and then scale up those successes, share those stories, and celebrate them.
Amazing. So I think we have a question from one of our attendees, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask that question. I'm not too sure what's going on with, I think his microphone might not be working because he just left. So we'll give him like a couple seconds to come back in. If not, if anybody else has a question, again, feel free to ask in the chat because I do have some other questions that I can ask Steve in the meantime. Oh, so there's a question. Okay. So I guess the first question that I have, then another question that I have for you is, what is one of the challenges, I guess, in terms of doing this type of research, in terms of taking in different perspectives, in terms of not just considering the environmental impacts in terms of the fish's well-being, but also considering the livelihoods of those who, again, rely on these fishes, and also the impacts that it can have for us and it means for our future?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of team science. One can't do it alone. This is not a problem that's going to be solved by biodiversity experts or fish ecologists. It's going to take all hands on deck, and we need to come at this from very diverse perspectives. So we need to be working with people that are experts in governance, people that are experts in economics and supply chains and human health and well-being and so on. So everything's interconnected, and I think that's the reason I pointed out this idea of an integrated water resource framework. It's not just fish. Fish live in water, and we use and manage water for all sorts of different reasons. And that's what really differentiates and in many ways, I think, makes inland fisheries management more complex than marine fisheries. In marine fisheries, by and large, the biggest issue is overexploitation. So when you're dealing with that, you're really dealing with an issue that's specific to the fisheries sector. So you know who needs to be at the table. But when we talk about inland fisheries, we have to have agriculture at the table. We have to have urban planners at the table. We have to have the dam managers at the table, and it goes on and on and on. And the stressors that I pointed out are coming from all directions. There's not one thing, there's many things, and we're all part of the problem, and therefore all part of the solution.
Perfect. So it looks like the way our chat function is working, if you do want to type a question for Steve, you can raise your hand and I can give you permission, or you can just take yourself off of mute and ask to see the question directly. It's totally up to you guys. I believe we have time for one more question, if there were those in the audience that had a question. Okay, if no one else has a question, I can ask you the final question, no worries. I guess my last question would be, how would you, what's your advice you would give to somebody who's potentially starting their early career research, and they don't really have, I guess, per se, a specialty, they're more of a generalist. What advice would you give them in terms of pursuing interdisciplinary work, in terms of doing work that also gets meaningful work done for the ecology side, but also meaningful work done for the sociology side?
Sure. So I think you definitely want expertise. It's okay to have diverse expertise. And in fact, I think that's where, a lot of benefit comes from. But as an early career researcher, I think what I would be doing is be trying to get some real world experience. And so, classroom matters. As an educator, I certainly believe in a good college or university education, but I also believe in learning from those that are on the front lines, learning from the practitioners who are managing fisheries, who are dealing with the NGOs that are on the front line, the environmental consultants, learning from the communities and rights holders who depend on fish and fisheries as well. So I know we talk about disciplines, and when we do so, we're oftentimes thinking about things in a traditional sort of classroom context. I'd like people to start thinking out of the box more, and realizing there's so many knowledge holders out there, and we need to learn from them as well.
Perfect. So that is all the time we have for questions from Steve. Thank you so much again, Steve, for taking time out of your busy schedule to do that. Without further ado, I'm going to be introducing your next host for the next part of this session. Her name is Amanda, and Amanda is a PhD candidate in the Fisheries, Ecology, and Conservation Physiology Laboratory at Carleton University. Her work focuses mainly on the human dimension of fisheries in the face of climate change, and she has a strong background and interest in fisheries management, governance, and policy issues.
Thank you, Acacia, and welcome everyone to our next session, which is going to be research presentations followed by a panel discussion. So we'll have each panelist will present a quick 5-minute presentation. Feel free to put your questions into the Q&A option here on Zoom as they come up during the talks, and I will get to those during the discussion session. So our first speaker today is Dr. Saba, who is a lecturer at the School of Agriculture at Lagos State University. He works in the intersection of biodiversity, conservation, and management of fisheries with a focus on human dimensions. And today he will be presenting on finding the balance between the ecological impacts and socioeconomic gains of non-native freshwater fishes. So Dr. Saba, you may now share your screen.
Okay. Is my screen visible? Is my slide visible now, please?
I cannot see the slides yet.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to share again. Share. Okay, how is it now?
So usually when you try to share a screen, you
Yes.
have to click on which screen you'd like to share. So
Yes.
we see a black screen that says you started screen sharing, but we don't see the slide.
Oh. Okay. Let me try again. Stop share.
So usually when you hit the share screen, it asks you to click on which screen you'd like to share.
Yes, exactly. That's what I can see here. But I hit on the PowerPoint slides, but I don't get it up. I don't know why. Okay, so again.
There it is.
Okay, is it up?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Amanda, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to present to you some of our research findings. And the title of this talk is Finding the Balance Between the Ecological Impacts and Economic Gains of Non-Native Freshwater Fishes. The second goal of the SDGs, which seeks to end hunger by the year 2030, may be far-fetched, judging from the impacts of the recent pandemic. In addition to the pre-existing challenges, which include climate change, pollution, overfishing, species invasion, among others, facing the production of food in some regions of the world. To enhance food security, many countries of the world have stepped up their fish production, mainly through aquaculture, and in the process, some non-native fishes are imported, basically because of their excellent growth and culture characteristics. Paradoxically, some of these alien fish species, which are species found outside their native ranges and natural distributions, may become invasive when they get introduced into the inland waters, where they threaten the biodiversity and health of the ecosystem. In many cases, this leads to huge economic losses. The successful introduction of these species into the wild may also be enhanced by natural and human factors. Therefore, because Malaysia is not left out in the wave of fish introductions, our research aimed at assessing the potential and existing ecological impacts and the socio-economic dimensions. Klang Valley, as you can see in figure 1 here, was the study area, and it is the most densely populated area within the Malaysian peninsula. Non-native fish species in the pet stores and rivers were assessed for their invasion risks. More so, the diet overlap between alien and native fishes was evaluated using stomach contents and stable isotope analysis. Finally, we assessed people's perception as well as the economic benefits of these fishes to the pet store owners. What we found was that about 11 non-native fish species were of high invasion risk, otherwise referred to as invasive. Besides, 2 of these species, including Nile tilapia, which is Oreochromis niloticus that originates from Africa, and the Amazon sailfin catfish, Pterygoplectus pardalis, which originates from South America, have established breeding populations in the rivers, while Nile tilapia competes with its native counterpart for food resources. Furthermore, educational level was the most important factor influencing people's knowledge, perceptions, and attitude regarding the impact and importance of these non-native fishes. Also, the pet store owners do benefit economically from the sale of these fishes and their accessories. So talking about sustainability, to gain the maximum benefits for both humans and the ecosystem, there is a need to strike a balance. And I could just remember the last quote of Prof. Cook just now. He mentioned, he underlined the word balance. So I can see the alignment between what he has presented and what I'm talking about now. So there's this need to strike this balance between the ecological impact and the socioeconomic gains of these species. And the 3 P's of sustainability, which refer to people, planet, and profit, need to be brought to the fore. And this addresses the social, environmental, and economic concerns to achieve sustainability. This approach, which is also referred to as the ecosystem-based approach, should be considered in any policy or management effort. Otherwise, the losses may eventually outweigh the benefits of these species. So these are some of our published articles. So for more information regarding our study, you may look up some of these articles. I may be contacted to provide more information on some of these findings. I sincerely appreciate your time listening to this talk. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saba. That was a great way to get us started. Next up, we have Dr. Dennis Zimmerman, who is a consultant and facilitator based out of Whitehorse, Yukon, Canada, with decades of experience in conservation conflict management, facilitation, and human dimensions work of fisheries. Dennis always works with communities and Indigenous governments at the intersection of fish, wildlife, habitat, and the community, with a focus on ensuring that locally derived values and priorities drive the process. And today, Dr. Zimmerman will be presenting on reconnecting the Broken Salmon Trail, Southern Lakes community-based salmon planning.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, but we don't see your slides.
Okay, I'm going to try that again. All right. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I'll start right away. Firstly, I'm not Dr. Zimmerman. I did try, but unfortunately, that was a failed attempt at becoming a doctor. So I am just Dennis Zimmerman. I just wanted to, thank you for the opportunity to present today. I have a rather long presentation that I will condense, and I'll try not to speak too fast, but it's more about giving you a snapshot of a process that I'm working on dealing with Yukon River Chinook in the Yukon Territory from a First Nation perspective. I'm on the traditional territory of the Kwantlen First Nation and the Ta'an Council in Whitehorse, Yukon. I have permission to share this presentation on behalf of a technical working team, and it refers to things in the first person. Because it is in their voice, in the First Nation citizens and government voice, and I am not a part of that voice. These are the beautiful Yukon River Chinook salmon at the end of its life cycle in our just off a tributary of the Yukon River. These are salmon people. These were people that were largely cut off from salmon in some ways by a barrier, by a dam to some extent. As well as just with declining abundance in salmon, it's harder and harder for them to harvest. They would almost consider themselves more caribou people now. So this is something that one needs to address. You can see in this picture, this is a snapshot of the ecosystem, and happens to be the Whitehorse fish ladder there, which is our hydro dam and a bit of a fish barrier. These First Nations are always looking at things holistically. So I should have mentioned, it's the Kwantlen, the Ta'an Council, and the Carcross-Tagish First Nation, those 3 First Nation governments, and they are self-governing. There's always a holistic approach to this. Salmon are never viewed in isolation. And it's always about protecting land water resources and passing on values and practices to future generations. It's a fairly large territory. Everything in the Yukon is quite large, 25,000 square kilometers. And this is the longest freshwater Chinook migration in the world at over 3,000 kilometers from the ocean back to spawn. They must travel through Alaska before they get to Canada. Part of this planning effort, we've been using a lot of illustrations because illustrations are, and I appreciated the reference to art earlier, just trying to bring in as much imagery as possible so you can see in this picture through Alaska, through Yukon, even into southern BC of Canada. It is a very long journey through many different, from the oceans all the way through to their headwaters in the Southern Lakes. Another illustration we're using, this is to demonstrate, and there's a bit of a two-eyed seeing approach here with oral knowledge and written knowledge, but everything comes from the glaciers, from these headwaters First Nations, and trickles down, and you can see a number of different principles and concepts laden into this illustration that we're using. We use these a lot for engagement with knowledge holders and citizens and youth to gather values and priorities for the First Nations. Caring, sharing, respecting salmon are, caring, sharing, respecting, and teaching are the main principles of this. And they do have a history of bringing back, in the case of caribou, for example, they've brought back a Southern Lakes caribou herd by conserving and managing in this way. So there is precedent. This is a community-based plan. It's not a technical plan. It's not a harvest management plan. It's not a political document. It brings people together, and it tries to hold equal value of Western science and traditional knowledge. It's very much around place. There are some very important places of tributaries such as Michi, McClintock, and Lake Labarge. Those won't mean much to you, but those are very special places to people here. Historically, there were large catches. There were harvests of about 300 to 400 fish per families in these areas. Now there are, in some cases, there's zero harvest. So you can imagine on the cultural loss of that, and the nutrient loss, and all the other aspects that go along with that. So we use a lot of testimonials from knowledge holders as well as old photography to demonstrate that these were fishing First Nations. I won't get into this, but it's unfortunately it's a chart of decline. It's being extirpated in certain far-reaching areas. So we've got some significant issues there. And there's a whole narrative around impacts, and those impacts were the gold rush, the Alaska Highway, the dam, residential school, urbanization, and habitat impacts and development. So there's a whole narrative of impacts that faces this plan. But one of the things the First Nations have done is tried to reframe this and said, they want to harvest salmon in order to continue with their respect and connection. But they also ask, what did the salmon need from us? Quite often we bring the salmon to the table. We hold a space for them at the table with us in the meeting. And either someone speaks on behalf of the salmon, or we ensure we check, and we put a piece of art usually that represents those salmon that's significant for a person at that meeting. So what do the salmon need from us? So story, this is Charlie Burns, an elder from Kwalndun, talking about salmon. Future generations are really important. That's my child on the left, and this is at a Ta'an culture camp, and just having that sharing and kids holding, cutting fish, eating fish. Barrier-free passage. We have a lot of beaver dams. We have a lot of migration routes that are obstructed in some way or another. So it's something we can do. And this is a really powerful, this is a Brandy Mays credit to her, a Kwalndun citizen and partner of the technical working group, where basically we've looked at written knowledge and oral knowledge, and we're basing a plan on this. And again, as I mentioned, care, share, respect, and teachings. And a couple of the sort of implementation items. So this is, they do a lot of restoration. This is an in-stream incubation effort that's happening on the Kwalndun traditional territory. And they're trying to do more research to ensure that, they're trying to bump up these stocks a little bit in order to sort of, obviously propagate new salmon. And we're, managing the wild versus the natural salmon as something. Lots of stewardship through culture, through song, through art. This is at Ta'an Culture Camp again, and kids participating in a drumming workshop. This is some work that actually Stephen's lab, Dr. Stephen Cook's lab, and Will Twardek and the Karkras-Tagish First Nation on some fish passage work. They were looking at sort of upstream migration and the physiological stress and things of that nature. And so this is them doing some of that research. These are obviously spawned out fish that they're doing all kinds of research on to get a sense of how productive they've been, and if we've had significant temperature increases resulting in pre-spawn mortality, so things of that nature. And this is a fishing weir in a very small tributary called Fox Creek, and they've got a video camera in there so they can monitor returning adults through this creek. And this is the Ta'an Council. And then, of course, ceremony and connection. This is on the Carcross-Tagish traditional territory. These are Tlingit neighbors that have come, and they have a salmon ceremony at something called Hakusti'i. And it's a very important part of their connection, and they invite the public to it. And we have a number of metrics when we know we will have succeeded. And there's a beautiful Yukon River Chinook coming back from its freshwater phase, nearing its spawning grounds, where it will nourish the bears, trees, bugs, and everything else in the ecosystem. And here's a little more information. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks so much. Next, we go on to Dr. Beth Neubauer, who is a freshwater scientist and conservation ecologist, completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Carleton University. Her research focuses on the social and ecological effects of climate change on small-scale inland fisheries in East Africa, and investigates the interface between evidence-based decision-making and policy in Canada. Her presentation today is titled Adapting to Shifting Resource Base: Climate Change Affects Fish and Fishery-Based Livelihoods in the Lake Victoria Basin in East Africa.
Thanks, Amanda. Is that working for everyone?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so thank you so much, Amanda, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today talking to you guys about some research that I've done. I'm going to talk today about the inland fisheries of the Lake Victoria Basin in East Africa, specifically about how climate change related shifts in biodiversity can have the potential to impact fishery-based livelihoods. So Lake Victoria in East Africa is the largest tropical lake in the world and Africa's most important source of inland fisheries production. The inland fisheries of the Lake Victoria Basin provide over 3 million people with their primary source of income and food security, and around 30 million people with essential sources of dietary protein. Lake Victoria fishery has gone through some major shifts in biodiversity. It was once a super diverse, multi-species fishery. However, a series of species introductions and other socio-ecological changes to the lake have led to the fishery being dominated by 3 main species: the Nile perch and the Nile tilapia, which are both introduced, and then a native silver cyprinid, which is locally known as mukene. So with these changes in species, fishing communities have had to adapt, and there was a shift in fishing practices from using these smaller artisanal gears to more efficient industrial gears and fish freezing processes. So as the biodiversity of the lake changed, so did fishing practices, and so did the social and economic structure of fishing communities. And having this kind of flexibility and ability to adapt is important because now fisheries are faced with a new threat, which is climate change. So this is a map of climate change vulnerability in freshwater fish species across Africa. And as you can see, about 80% of species in the Lake Victoria Basin are projected to be vulnerable. So this is very likely to translate to further changes in fishery productivity and likely to have impacts on fishers' livelihoods. So we wanted to find out how fishing communities in the Lake Victoria Basin are experiencing climate change. And so we did a series of household surveys and focus group discussions to ask communities about their perceptions of climate change and then how they can build on their past experiences with change to adapt into the future. So what did people notice? Well, most people noticed that there are changes in weather and wind patterns, that there's an increasing frequency of droughts and floods, and that the timing of the rainy and dry seasons is changing. So these environmental effects are all noted to alter fish movement patterns and breeding patterns, and can lead to decreases in catch rates of Nile perch and Nile tilapia. Of course, that's mixed up with other stressors, but it is one of the things they've noticed. This tends to have negative effects on income and food security in households and communities. And so we asked fishers, when faced with these changes, what kind of strategies can be used to adapt? So here I'm showing results from the survey that shows the percentage of respondents who indicated what they used as different kinds of adaptation strategies. So we found that in most cases, most fishers are actually just continuing fishing as usual, but then a lot of fishers also tried techniques like changing species. So they might shift from Nile perch to mukene, for example. They tried increasing fishing pressure, or they tried changing fishing grounds and maybe migrating to different landing sites. And then we also asked whether the different adaptation options had either a positive, a negative, or no impact on their livelihoods in terms of income and food security. So the positive impacts are in blue, and then the negative or no impacts are in the redder tones. And we found that for the majority of the most popular adaptive options, they actually had a negative impact or no change at all. But then there are a few exceptions. So for example, changing target species did have a positive impact on livelihoods about half the time. One of the key species that fishers use is mukene, or the small cyprinid that I talked about. This is one of the species that was not perceived to be declining as much as the other two. And there's some really interesting ongoing research that's showing the potential for small fish to provide sustainable fisheries into the future. But a key constraint with mukene currently is post-harvest losses. So mukene are sun-dried, and when there's excess rain, they can easily be damaged or rot. So you can see in the graph there that improving fish processing, although not practiced by as many people, has a positive impact on income and food security. So we can explore technologies like the solar dryer pictured there that can be used to help prevent post-harvest losses. So in summary, climate change affects both fish and fishery-based livelihoods in the Lake Victoria Basin. And there's a need to focus on adaptive actions that respond to the shifts in the fishery resource base. And fishing households can draw on past experiences with ecological change to determine adaptive strategies. So thank you very much. My contact information is there, and I'll be around for the Q&A after as well. So thanks for listening.
Great. Next, we have a pre-recorded talk from Naren Srinivasan, who is a conservation biologist currently working for the Wildlife Association of South India as head of research and conservation. He has a strong background in using recreational angling as a tool for conservation and species protection. One of his interests is to help marginalized fishermen to organize and self-govern a sustainable capture fishery in the Shiva Fish Sanctuary. His talk today is titled Fish Poachers or Marginalized Fishers, a closer look at Coveri's dynamite fishing. So I'm going to share my screen here.
In my screen. There we go. Okay. Talk a little bit about a group of fishermen that live in the along the middle course of the Kaveri River, that's in South India. And I've titled this talk Fish Poachers or Marginalized Fishers, because I think that sums up the plight of these people. They are involved with a certain amount of unsustainable fishing, such as dynamite fishing, but that's largely due to the way we manage our water resources in India. So I'll just quickly introduce you to the area that we're talking about. So that's the middle course of the Kaveri marked in D in the graph on the bottom right. And that is where the river cascades over the Deccan Tracts. And she continues to flow down for about 100 kilometers. And during this, in this region, the river is very turbulent. So you've got these massive rapids, there are waterfalls, there are deep gorges, there are big pools. It's really fantastic to take a walk down this river sometimes. And, with this habitat diversity comes a diversity of fish. So in this one single frame here, you can see close to around 5 species of fish. In fact, this area is estimated to have anywhere between 75 to 120 species of fish. Okay? So a lot of fish and a lot of fishing as well. This is a photograph of Das. He is a fisherman that we work with quite closely. He used to be, he was known as a poacher. But today he helps us a lot with our surveys, and he's excellent with the cast net, gill nets, angling, dynamite fishing, you name it. I mean, you want to catch any species of fish, he knows where to find them. But sometimes he too is forced to unsustainable methods of fishing. And that's largely because of the way we manage our fisheries or our water resources in India. So how it's done is that the Department of Fisheries owns most of the water resources and they lease them out to fishermen. Unfortunately, many of these fishermen they can't read or write. So that's their first hurdle. They can't even apply for the licenses. Then there's the issue of fronting the fee. And in India, India is politically quite diverse. And there are umpteen number of agendas that one needs to maneuver before you're even eligible to apply for these licenses. But say you manage to pull it off and purchase a license. There's still losses due to floods, there's disease. And one point that fishermen bring up all the time is that they have to wait for 3 or 4 months for the fish to grow before they can be harvested. But when you go to the river, it's the fish are always available. It's a free for all. Then there are transportation costs. So you get the big picture. It's not the most lucrative livelihood. So they turn to the next best thing that they know of, which is dynamite fishing. And the rivers in this area, you'll find incense sticks sticking out from tree trunks, and that's where they light the dynamite and throw it into the river. And for those of you who have not seen that before, there's a little clip on the bottom right. It is essentially an underwater detonation, and a large number of animals, fish, snakes, otters, whatever it might be, are affected by this. And the photograph on the top right shows you, this was published in one of the newspapers, local newspapers here. And there are about 20 people who were locked up after this. There were boats confiscated, nets that were burned. So it's not a very pretty picture. It's quite tense. So we try and interact with these fishermen as much as possible. When we're out in the field, we bump into them, we have conversations with them, and we found out something interesting. And that is that even within this fisherman community, there is a divide. Some of them believe that the only way for them is dynamite fishing. Whereas on the other hand, you have some fishermen who understand how unsustainable dynamite fishing is, and they're looking for something new. So we work within this space and try and offer up various market-based incentives, which help them see a more sustainable future. And one of them has been angling. We have some fantastic species like this humpback marset that people love to go angling for. But for me, what really sums it up well is the picture on the right. You have a father and a son sitting by a river, there are elephants around you, there's beautiful nature, and they're sitting there and interacting with a former poacher, now turned angling guide. And for that angling guide, this is a huge identity boost. And also this river that was an unsafe environment for him earlier is now a safe place where he can work in peace. So, and that's helped a lot with, with social buy-in to this program. And we've also been able to develop a little bit of a conservation campaign, Save the Marcia, Save the Rivers, and we try and include local fishermen, these local fishermen especially, into the program. So if you want to know more about that, we've got some articles up on our website. We also update our Instagram page quite regularly, so do follow us. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Great, those were all wonderful talks. So a big thank you to all of our panelists today. I don't know about you, but I have a big itch to travel now. So now we're going to move on right into our discussion. I have some questions here for our panelists. So I'll direct this one at Dennis Zimmerman. What is the biggest obstacle to overcome when developing a community-based fisheries plan?
Great, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think one of the biggest obstacles is, in many ways, this imbalance. We have a number of presenters discussed around the holistic or the multidisciplinary nature of fisheries, and in our case, salmon. I think we do have a really drastic imbalance in the sense of Western science essentially dominating the entire process. So a lot of our work on fisheries management is a sort of treaty with Alaska and between US and Canada, United States and Canada. And it's based purely on Western science, and it doesn't reflect the cultural side of things, the importance, the identity-based issues, habitat concerns, and very little translates to the management. So when you present a community-based plan, I think quite often it's just sort of pushed into a corner. Those are nice pictures, but really they do represent, what are the values and priorities of these governments. So again, the imbalance and the domination of Western science in isolation, going it alone, is probably the biggest obstacle for a community-based plan. Thanks.
Great. Are there any other panelists that want to jump on that question? So again, the biggest obstacles to overcome when trying to develop community-based fishing plans? No? Okay, I'll move on. We have a question here for Dr. Saba. So Dr. Saba, what are some of the recommendations for managing the impacts of non-native fishes?
Okay, thank you. For fish species to invade a water body, there are certain stages they go through. And one of which is after they get imported, they escape into the inland waters. That's introduction. After that, they get established, spread, and finally invade. Therefore, management of the impacts depend on the specific stage of invasion. So it means there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So if the situation is at its early stage, the management efforts are easier and less costly. So efforts at this stage may target prevention of fish introduction and its establishment. So introduction can be prevented through policies and enforcement by relevant government agencies. Also, the general public, especially in some countries like Malaysia, the ornamental fish hobbyists need to be educated on the dangers of dumping the non-native fishes into the inland waters. Therefore, the best way to manage is to prevent introduction. However, if the species are already established, the focus will be to prevent the spread and to eradicate. So in addition to other options of controlling and eradicating the non-native species, some could be harvested and put to other beneficial uses. A good example is the Amazon sailfin catfish, which has been useful for some industrial applications, like its use in fish feed, formulation, and the production of collagen. I think that answers the question. Thank you.
Yes, great. Any other panelists want to jump on that?
Well, for the work that I do in East Africa, it's, two of the three species that we're working with are non-native fishes as well, and they've become extremely important parts of the fishery. And one of them is Nile tilapia, which is a species that you brought up. And I actually had a question for you of whether the Nile tilapia that's been, that's escaped into some of the rivers that you mentioned, have there been some fisheries that have been established for those burgeoning populations?
Okay, you mean here in Malaysia?
Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay, actually, Nile tilapia is basically, yes, in the inland fisheries that has been established, because so far they constitute the largest proportion of non-native fish species harvested from the inland waters. And talking about the aquaculture sector, there's a hybrid species that has been developed. That is red tilapia. So this is a cross between Nile tilapia and another species of tilapia. So we have the red tilapia, and this species is highly accepted, widely accepted by the people. So, but there's no specific fishery in terms of maybe in a particular lake or a river where this species is known for. But generally, in the inland waters, Nile tilapia has established, and it's really benefiting the fishery sector in the country.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks. So we'll move on here. I have a question for Naren. How organized, this is like a two-part question here. So how organized is the angling sector in India, and how can angling contribute to sustainable fisheries?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So to be honest, angling in India is not organized at all. So there's hardly any policy in place. There's no regulation for the activity. And that's quite surprising because the activity has been around in India for over 50 years. And but it's been practiced in the background. So it's, almost every state in India has their own angling association. But these are generally comprised of, say, anywhere from 50 people to 200 or 300 people sometimes. So they're very small communities, small groups that practice the activity. And what's interesting has actually been a shift that I've noticed, at least in the last 8 to 10 years, where an activity which was once quite well linked to conservation, or was quite well linked to nature appreciation, is now slowly shifting to an activity that is largely driven by social media. So there's been a huge access with regard to tackle, that's fishing lures, fishing rods, whatever it might be. The Chinese market is kind of completely opened up to that, and because of that, you have more and more anglers that are going out. So there's a slight shift in the nature of the behavior, which is a bit worrisome. And I believe that India does need a policy to manage this in the near future. But from the point of benefits of the program, there are several. One is just the intrinsic ecotourism nature of the activity. It's a great experience. If any of you have been out angling, it's I don't need to convince you about that, but it's really a fantastic experience, and people love it in India as well. Like I mentioned in my talk, it also offers an alternate livelihood for some of these marginalized fishermen. They have a very unique skill set, and I believe that skill set is actually on its way out. It's becoming more and more illegitimized. So there is opportunities for them in this space. There is also opportunity for monitoring fish, and this is something that I've been pushing for the last couple of years, especially through a citizen science platform. It's quite popular in India, especially with birds. You have thousands and thousands of people, volunteering information for free many of the time, which scientists are able to use to monitor fish population, bird population trends, whatever it might be. So something on those lines is also a huge benefit from an organized recreational angling program. And I believe that India really needs a new management regime for many of its water bodies. So right now it's either aquaculture, or it's hydroelectricity, or it's irrigation. But a new activity around the lines of recreational fishing or recreational angling areas would definitely have more of a conservation-oriented management scope rather than just one that's purely utilitarian. So there are a lot of benefits, and I really do hope that the activity receives a lot of attention moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Do any other panelists want to talk about how angling contributes to sustainable fisheries, perhaps in other fisheries outside of India?
If I may, I wanted to just pick up on something. It's not quite answering that question, but I really appreciated the presentation there, and the ability to bring in these poachers. I mean, that when you're looking at an unregulated industry, bringing in those that know how to fish, whether it be illegal for whatever their motivations are, I think that was really great to see it in that context, because I know we deal with that as well, where we have unregulated fishing or over harvesting, but it's when it goes underground and people don't have dialogue, then you're much farther behind. So I really appreciated how you brought them into almost as ambassadors into the discussion. I thought that was really, really cool to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Okay, the next question that we have here is for Dr. Beth Neubauer. So you talked about some interesting ways to adapt within the fishery, but are there any other adaptation options that could help to improve fishery sustainability that don't involve fishing or fish processing?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in the presentation today, I only really talked about how to adapt within the fishery itself, because that's kind of the most immediate thing that people have access to and an important area to understand. But there are a lot of options that we talked about that take people outside of the fishery as well. And those kinds of adaptations actually tend to have, like in the slide where I showed the different colors, if you would look at the colors for the ones that take them outside of the fishery, there's a lot more blue there. So a lot more positive impacts on long-term household stability. An obvious important one is diversifying livelihoods into activities, particularly activities that are resilient or resistant to the effects of climate change. So things like adjusting gardening practices and that kind of thing. And we also talked a lot about how some of the barriers to that can be overcome by having communities engage in groups and be more sort of stationary in their livelihoods, and in terms of caring for the environment and taking an ecosystem-based approach. And there's a lot of, in terms of an ecosystem-based approach to managing the fishery. And it was very interesting to talk to people about how there's a sort of like an innate understanding that that's what's needed and that's what people want to do. So there's some interesting work going on in that sphere.
Great. Do any panelists want to add to that? No? Okay, so we have another question here for Dr. Saba. So it is said here that pet store owners are a small minority of benefactors. What are the social and economic benefits to the wider society?
Yes, thank you for the question. I agree 100% that the pet store owners are a minority of benefactors. But actually, the benefits coming from these fish species go beyond the pet store owners, but it was because of time. So other sections of the community also benefit from these alien fishes. For example, between 2007 and 2018, we assessed the landings, the aquaculture production and landings of the freshwater fishes in the country, and we found out that about 93% of the cultured fishes produced in the country came from non-native fish species. So this translates to the economic benefits for the culturists, wholesalers, as well as the retailers. In the same vein, these species, they contributed about 27% of the fish landings from the inland water bodies. So these are facts that establish the importance of these fish species to other sections of the community, of the country, apart from only the pet store owners. So I think that answers the question. Thank you.
Great. So that about wraps up our panel discussion. I want to give a big thank you again to everyone, all of our presenters today, as well as everyone that attended and gave in or submitted some questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Beth Neubauer for the next session.
Right. Thank you so much, Amanda. And thanks to all the speakers. That was really, really interesting. In our next section, we're going to be talking a little bit about art in how that impacts us. So as human beings, our interaction and connection with the natural world is often expressed through art, music, dance, and song. And that's been since time immemorial. And among such depictions, freshwater systems are very prominently featured. So it's through these depictions that we can really gain a deeper understanding of the significance of those species and places to societies and cultures. So for example, the image that we're looking at here in this cover slide is a painting by a Métis artist, Christy Belcourt, called The Great Mystery of Water. And this is just one example of Belcourt's ability to inspire the love of the natural world and awe at the ways that water, fish, and the natural world can connect us. So Shannon is going to share a quick tour of fish and fisheries through the lens of art, song, and story to discuss the role that these expressions can play in helping us to understand, find, and communicate solutions for our fisheries. Take it away, Shannon.
All right, thanks, Beth. So I'm just going to switch to our next slide here. So the first thing I want to do is actually start by inviting you to slow down and relax your brain. So this part of the session is meant to act as a bit of a palate cleanser of sorts. So we're going to give your analytical brain a rest, and we're going to stimulate your creative brain. And in doing so, hopefully we can inspire some creative thinking and get us on the path to discussing the different ways that we can envision and share these hopes for solutions in inland fisheries. So I am not so much a storyteller, I guess, as I am a story collector. Like many of you, I grew up on fish stories. So stories of my father and grandfather catching fish all over the Ottawa Valley. And the accompanying hyperbole of those stories in particular was a major part of my childhood. And those stories slowly melded with my own experiences. So days spent on the beach when I was a kid, cleaning our massive trout haul from the Ottawa River, or using frogs to target bass in the weeds. And these days I have my own fish stories. So stories of the people and places and fish that I've met along the way, and stories of the ones, several, that got away. And I've spent a lot of time collecting stories over the years. So not just my fish stories, but other people's too, because everyone has a fish story. And these stories connect us not only to each other, but to generations gone by and to environments and circumstances changed. So you cannot catch the numbers of trout that we used to when I was a kid on the Ottawa River anymore. And while we thankfully, very thankfully, fish with plastic frogs now, neither amphibians or freshwater environments are faring particularly well around the world. And so there are other stories too, like these of Moldy Head or Salmon Boy. These are traditional stories told by many Western and Northern First Nations in Canada that teach successive generations the importance of interacting respectfully, not only with salmon and fish, but with all of nature. So this image on the left here by Chris Martin, and yes, it is Chris Martin of Coldplay, is intended to evoke emotions like these feelings of powerlessness at these changes. And in this case, the issue of rising sea levels. And I sometimes feel similarly powerless thinking of freshwater fisheries issues, and I'm sure many of us do. So this is a shared emotion that can be brought to us by this art. And of course, it's not all about stories, although those might be my favorite. So I had a master's student in 2019, Linnea Kinval, and she studied artist perspectives on environmentalism and sustainability in art and the perceived value of that art for changing behavior. And I was blown away when she found numerous examples, such as a study by Marks, Chandler, and Baldwin in 2014, who found that a community in Australia that hosted a biannual environmental arts festival showed increased pro-environmental behavior in that community over time. And so ever since, her project has had me wondering about all of the ways in which all forms of art, so not just visual art, but song and story and dance, all forms, how this can help us not only to remember and not only help us to connect and value, but maybe help us envision the future. And of course, art never works in isolation. So art and song is like wine and cheese. Multimedia expressions are becoming increasingly common. We're starting to see them in a lot of different areas. And so this little piece shown here on the screen for you, this is another of Christy Belcourt's. And when she shared it on Twitter, she shared it using a river song as a bit of a multimedia piece. So I'm going to share that with you. With me to the Mississippi, we'll take a boat to the land of dreams, stream down the river down to New Orleans.
the band that's a meter, old friends that's a greeter, where all the proud and the elite folks meet, heaven on earth on.
So I hope you like that as much as I did. I just found that a really wonderful way to share art, and I really appreciate the coming together of different forms of art to evoke those emotions. And of course, speaking of songs, we use songs to connect generations. This song here that I have on the screen, Machli Jal Ki Rani Hai, and I apologize to any Hindi speakers out there, mine is not great. But this is a folk song well known to children across India. It's taught in schools, it's sung in homes, and I learned it while preparing for a World Fish Migration Day camp. And my intention there was to teach it to the kids, but not entirely surprisingly, the kids knew it far better than I did, and so they had fun teaching it to me instead. And so initially I was going to show you a clip of the song, but the media is a little bit wonky. So instead, I just want to bring your attention to the English translation of the words, because I think this is another great example of how we can use art to teach from generation to generation the values of freshwater fisheries and water. So in this case, the idea that we don't want to take fish out of the water. And so speaking of World Fish Migration Day, the folks behind that organization also developed the Eurofishing contest, which I'm sure is known to many of you, and the results and winners of which were incredible. So if you haven't checked out the website, I really encourage you to. It's full of really inspiring songs. And more recently, Paushali Sahu, a Bengali digital marketer and singer, asked a simple question on Twitter: what is your favorite river song? And she received hundreds of replies. Now, many of these feature songs from South Asia, so it is 100% worth checking out this thread to hear about some amazing new music. But the thing that really inspired me was that people responding to her question in the timeline talked at length about why they loved these songs and how connected they felt to these rivers because of them. And this got me thinking about just how big the global river and fish song playlist could be and how we could use it to connect to these solutions. And so we're already seeing the blend of art and science in many different fields. So in her 2018 TEDx CERN talk that was very highly watched, Elena Bennett discussed the recipe for a good Anthropocene. And she called for us to look for these positive stories to help us steer away from disaster, but also to help us enable this positive future. And put more simply, you can't be what you can't see. We need to be able to see these positive futures in order to be able to steer towards them. And this is where art comes in. Stories, art, and song can remind us of the past, they can warn us of the present, but they can also help us envision a better future. And artists all around the world are already working on these concepts. So from the Affirmative Art Project that aims to help people identify and envision their goals for their own and our shared future, to not-for-profit groups like Before It's Too Late, which partners with artists, climate activists, and government agencies to paint murals and design, seriously, augmented reality videos that bring awareness to climate change solutions. So what does the future for freshwater fisheries look like then when we envision a happy, healthy future for fish and fisheries? What do we see when we think about these future scenarios? So maybe in your mind, it looks something like this, if you are like me, a Christy Belcourt fan, or maybe it looks something like this. But for many of us, I think it probably looks like something else entirely. So a song, a story, a video game, or combinations thereof. And so I'm interested in asking questions about how we help harness this power in our work to help support these sustainable freshwater futures. Because we spend a lot of time talking about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, but I'm not sure how often we bring other artists and other visionaries on board our teams from the very beginning to help guide us in envisioning and communicating not only our work or its outcomes, but also its resulting actions. And I know that many of you are absolutely out there already working with artists, some of whom are probably shown on the screen here, to create things like figures and graphical abstracts. And that is fantastic, and we should absolutely keep doing that. But what I'm suggesting or hoping for is that we take this further. So an example here of a project called the Virtual Water Gallery from the University of Saskatchewan. And this is part of the Global Water Futures program. And the Virtual Water Gallery pairs scientists and artists together from the very beginning to try and teach and inspire the public about freshwater issues. Or there's this example as well, which is where the Ottawa River Keeper, a local conservation society, paired with artists from the Canadian Art Collective to hold a show called Point of View. And this art show's proceeds went to support the Ottawa River Keepers activities directly. And in fact, it was so successful that another event, River Variations, is happening as we speak. So these projects can work. And the final example I'd like to show is a result of a partnership between Keep Fish Wet, an organization that strives to educate anglers on best practices, and an artist named Bree Dostie from the Confluence Collective. And so this piece is an effort to show science-based best practices in an engaging and inspiring way. And it's destined for tackle shops and all kinds of gear shops and waterfronts, and going to be arriving there shortly. So that's really exciting. And I hope that these examples of different ways of communicating love for freshwaters and partnering science and art have been inspirational. So for me, I find this particularly interesting and exciting because we spend a lot of time trying to use science and evidence to create behavioral change. And I think that maybe it's time we pair science and evidence with passion and wonder as seen through the eyes of the arts, so that we can not only encourage change, but to evoke it and inspire it. And maybe if we are looking for a way to support a sustainable future for fish, fishers, and fisheries, that these are the partners we're looking for. And so with that, we're going to transition out of my talking mode and into our final session. So I just want to ask you to keep some of the images of the art that you saw in your mind and actually just turn your head away from your computer screen to look at something else far away in the room for 20 seconds. I actually attended a conference recently where this was a practice, and it was admittedly awkward for the first few times, but I actually felt that over time it became really effective at relaxing the brain. So you're welcome to think of the art or think of this beautiful image of salmon transitioning marine nutrients into fresh water, whatever your pleasure. But turn your head away, stare far to the other end of a room, and I'll call you back after 20 seconds, and then we'll enter our last session. Okay, so hopefully that was worth it. There we go. Okay, so this is the final segment of our open house session. We have a little bit of time, and I wanted to just take another quick minute to point out that although we're going to be talking about the future of the cluster, the TBTI Inland Fisheries Cluster, everyone is welcome. So if you're tuning in out of interest, if you are a past or prospective member, a member of a different cluster or different organization entirely, or even a member of the public, all of your voices are welcome here. So the Inland Fisheries Cluster has been a group since 2015, and we have collaborated on a number of different projects within our cluster and with other clusters as well, but we have a lot of options on where we go from here. So this cluster in particular was born as a result of the conference that Steve mentioned earlier in his presentation, the FAO Global Conference on Inland Fisheries in Rome in 2015. And the intent then, broadly speaking, was to recognize the unique attributes of inland fisheries systems ecologically and socially, and to support recognition of the importance of these fisheries through global research. And so since then, in addition to all of the fantastic work all of you have been doing in your universities and organizations, cluster members have worked together to produce an ebook, The Intersectoral Governance of Inland Fisheries, which is still available on the TBTI website. And many of us have collaborated with other clusters on numerous other research outputs. But over the past few years, we have admittedly been a little quiet. And yet in the meantime, we have seen increasing attention being paid within our research spheres and within broader media on issues related to the status of freshwater fish and ecosystems. And this has been wonderful to see. But it also has me thinking that we are lacking similar attention to the shared stories between fish and fishers and fishing communities. So what happens to these fisheries and fishing communities when these endangered fish are endangered and forgotten? And I think that this is where our cluster has an opportunity. So as an interdisciplinary group, we have the chance to tell these stories and to help shine the light not only on fish populations, but on fisheries, fishing communities, and the fishing cultures whose fates are so tightly interwoven with those of the fish themselves. And so to that effect, I sent out an email to cluster members a few weeks ago, asking a really simple question. How can we help? So how can we help our members in their mission to conduct their important work, to share their important stories, and to connect those stories to a global thread? And so we received a number of really fantastic responses, and the takeaways from those responses are on the screen for you. And so, for example, we had responses calling for more opportunities for collaboration, particularly on cross-cutting issues. So women and gender were mentioned, Indigenous fisheries were mentioned, but we also had people, if you look a little bit further down on the screen here, talking about chances to exchange information with other freshwater organizations. We had people looking for more communication type activities, so information on funding and collaboration, networking opportunities, so the chance to hear what other people are doing. And then we also had a suggestion that we also continue to maintain our focus on transdisciplinarity and governance issues so that we can maintain an identity that's different from other actions or organizations while still being complementary. And then last but not least, of course, there was always some interest in financial support, as have we all. So these are the responses that we received. And I thought that it would be nice if we could maybe hear from those of you who are sharing your time with us today. So I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed and hope that this works. But on your screen, we have a link. So you just have to type in joinmyquiz.com into your search bar. And when you are prompted, enter a code 064545. And so I'm actually going to stop sharing this screen, in theory, and start sharing that screen. And then I'm also going to join in from my phone, and hopefully we can make this quiz happen. By the way, I should point out that this is entirely anonymous. You will be given a ridiculous name, and there we go. I made it seem so easy. One of you has beaten me to it. Oh no, okay. So I'm probably not the only one who found that one went by a little fast, but you can see some of the results on the screen here. We have definitely some interest in networking and communication, some interest in opportunities for paper authorship, and research collaboration. So really networking type activities here, and generously, nobody chose none of the above. So let's move on to the next question here. And so this question and the next one are more of these networking type activities. So we have a number of clusters in TBTI, and so we're interested in learning if there are any in particular that you would particularly like to collaborate with. And there's no, I mean, you can choose as many as you like. All of these questions are set to accept multiple responses. So there we go. Okay, so global synthesis and transdisciplinary fisheries are the big winners of this one. And let's go on to see if people feel the same about the next ones. Okay. All right. So here again, we're seeing some interest in collaborating with groups such as Fish as Food and Global Change Responses and transboundary interaction clusters as well. And then I believe this is the final question. So thank you for your patience here. This is a bit of a trickier one. So if you're a fishery, and here just choose one of the fisheries that you work with, or you can enter multiple responses if you want to respond for multiple fisheries. But if your fishery was a species assessed on the endangered species list, how would you describe the status of the fishery you work with most? So would it be least concern? Would it be endangered? Would it be critically endangered? Okay. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure I was responding to this poll correctly. So if anyone was trying to participate and struggling a little bit, you have my empathy. So interestingly, and I hope that Ian got a kick out of this, if he is still in the audience, I included the unassessed option because of course, so many of us working with inland fisheries are dealing with really data poor fisheries and trying to find answers where there's so little information available. Okay, so thank you so much. I hope that that was as fun for you as it was for me. I'm now going to switch back over to my original screen here, and we're going to finish up with the last little portion of our discussion. So we don't have too much time. But I think it's, whoops, my apologies. It's absolutely worth going into these two questions here for our discussion. So if you do want to participate, we would absolutely love to hear from you. You have the option of commenting on the YouTube live stream. You are welcome to comment in the Q&A if you're attending via Zoom. If you are shy, you are welcome to send an email to info@infinityses.com. Any of that will arrive to us in the next 8 minutes, or 10 minutes rather. But now that we've sort of been thinking about some of the incredible research that we've heard about today, we've talked a little bit about this cluster and some of the things that people are interested in getting out of their experiences with the cluster. I just want to invite everyone, so including our hosts and our speakers, to have a look at these two questions and offer your thoughts. So what activities or actions can the cluster provide that would best support you, our members, and your community? And can anyone share an example of a scalable initiative or any success story in the freshwater small-scale fisheries realm where researchers and the community came together to learn, to share, or to solve problems? So at this point, I will stop talking and open up the floor to anyone who has a question or comment. And first, I have to find the chat. Okay, so I see someone has raised a hand. Bear with me while I try and, there you go. So you should be able to unmute yourself now and have your say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to suggest, first of all, I'm speaking from Nigeria. My name is Foluke Areola, and I think we need to carry out awareness campaign about the strength and opportunities that we have for the small scale operators to know how they have unhindered access to international markets for their products, unlike aquaculture products in our country. And if that is there, what are the limitations and how can we help them to overcome the limitations? And the limitation I see for now has to do with product handling, quality assurance, how to get them certified. So, and if we can do this for the small scale fisheries in Nigeria, then we will be able to help them develop the value chain and also and also help to increase, to improve the productivity of the sector and increase the sustainability and what comes to them as income, and so that their livelihood is improved. I believe that if they are aware that if they handle their products well, there is market even outside the country for them, it will be an incentive to make them work better. And I'm proposing that we can help in areas of capacity building in terms of training the operators in the sector, upscaling infrastructure. I saw the solar dryer in one of the presentations. Is something that can be given if there's funding for that at the landing site, and and also to develop the landing sites that we have. The landing sites are not all of them are up to standard. So if that can be done, if the cluster can, if we can do that, and also if we can help collaboration of linking the small scale fishers to off-takers, people who will take their products and help develop them, or if we can help them to develop their value chain themselves and be the ones that are exporting their products, so that we cut off middle people. I think those collaborative activities will increase the volume of or productivity in that sector. And also if we can facilitate linkages with aggregators, off-takers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Foluke Areola. That was some wonderful thoughts there. I hope you saw I was trying to keep up and write everything down as you were speaking. And I really appreciate some of your thoughts specifically as they relate to potential cross-collaboration between some of our other clusters as well, fish as food and access to markets. And I think you're absolutely right in that there are opportunities here for us to work together to offer some really meaningful support there. Thank you, that's fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Would anyone else like to have a say on either question?
Can I still say more things?
Sure, yes, by all means.
I didn't really go far with the infrastructural capacity development that I had in mind. I only remembered the solar panel that I saw in one of the presentations. But for us in Nigeria, it would be good to have mobile preservation units like cooler boxes, mobile ice flakes making machines in the rural areas so that they can take ice to sea, and smoking kilns or other processing facilities. Because what we have is that because the landing sites and the fisher folks are in remote areas, they lose most of the fish that is produced because of lack of preservation facilities, and we still have people burying some of their the fish caught, since if they can't get them sold in a day. And all these ways of preserving using sand and bags is still being practiced. And so I think a lot can be done in that regard if there is a way to help to facilitate getting that done. I already spoke about the landing sites, the general hygiene of the operators, teaching them about cleanliness of the craft and so on. So, or even teaching them the basic rudiments of HACCP, how to appreciate what it is, hazard analysis, critical control. If this happens, if they have more catches, how do they handle it? How can they preserve it? What can they do? Simple things about salting and filleting and removing the guts and so on. I think this will help very much to. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That is, I mean, a marvelous list, and I think it really shows just how much work we have to do, and how much we can offer in terms of supporting the communities that we work in and are part of. We have 2 minutes, so a very quick comment. If anyone has any final words. Beth, I noticed you're unmuted. Have you been waiting patiently?
Well, I think just in hearing what Fuluke was just talking about, and in the side chat, I've already talked to 2 of the other panelists that were on today and thinking about ways that we could possibly work together. And I think maybe in terms of, since a lot of people seem to want opportunities to collaborate and that kind of thing, having some kind of more regular forum like this one where we can get the cluster together and even just share. I mean, it doesn't have to be, you know, that often, but more often than once a year, to get the cluster together and have people, you know, share what they're doing, places where we can maybe get a database of different projects and possibilities to collaborate so that people can actually find each other and get to know each other a little bit would be a tool that might be really important for the future. There's a lot of, obviously, like lots of similarities and ways that we could work together. So that's one thought that I had.
I think that is an absolutely perfect final note. Thanks, Beth. I can't think of a better note to end on. So as it happens, it's almost time to turn things over to the next group. So on behalf of all of our hosts, our speakers and panelists for today, I just want to thank you for joining us and for participating so fully in our discussions. These conversations are absolutely just getting started. So for those of you who are cluster members, we will be moving forward from here with these ideas. So keep your eyes open for upcoming news from this cluster, and it's going to be great to see where we go from here. So thank you again so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of TBTI's SSF Open House. I hope you get the chance to enjoy many more sessions. So thank you.